Well, in 2008, we put in the review that was published in 2008, the original review, I put quite a lot of emphasis on working the basic business as usual scenarios. So what's a realistic view of economic growth, the energy intensity of growth, the emissions intensity of energy, on the basis that the world doesn't succeed in coming to grips with mitigation policy, because that's the starting point, that's the curve that has to be bent by policy. And it happened that work a few years ago led to a substantial revision of international expectations of business as usual emissions growth. In the IPCC work, of course, there had to be a view on underlying emissions growth to feed into the scientific assessments. The IPCC used a range of economic scenarios with varying degrees of mitigation, various degrees of underlying economic growth, various degrees of energy intensity of growth and composition of energy. And of all those scenarios, there was one, A1FI, that was thought to be extreme, that was meant to show what things would look like if growth was crazily high, the energy intensity of growth was crazily high, the emissions intensity of energy was crazily high. Well, in carefully reworking the IPCC revisions, and especially for the three big developing countries, China, Indonesia and India, the review came to the view that the extreme scenario, which hadn't been taken seriously, was actually the closest to what was likely to happen. In fact, the analysis showed that business as usual emissions were likely to track a bit ahead, a bit above the A1FI scenario. Been a fair bit of revision of the perspective of the international agencies since then, including the International Energy Agency, and Nick Stern in his yearly lecture to the American Economic Association in 2009 recognised the changes that needed to be made in the basic perspectives as a result of the work that we did. That upward revision came mainly from taking a more realistic view of a momentum of growth in the big developing countries. China was a very big story, but India and Indonesia not small stories in the global emissions picture. But we worked through that again, and in working through things again, of course, something's changed in the last few years. We've had a global financial crisis, which set back, or which sent economic output into negative territory for most of the developed world, not for Australia, but for all other developed countries. But it only briefly and slightly dented growth in the large developing countries, and didn't much dent growth in the developing world as a whole, or dented growth for only a short period. And in the revision of the scenarios, the working through the implications of this is particularly important. This slide simply shows how through what I call the Great Crash of 2008, it's the title of my book on the financial crisis, through the Great Crash, actual economic growth in the developed countries ended up, of course, collapsing compared with earlier expectations over those years, but it's continued to, but it's led to a downward revision in expectations of developed country growth. And in the international agencies, the and here we've got data from the International Monetary Fund and the International Energy Agency. There's been a tendency to revise downwards a little bit longer-term expectations for developing countries as well. I don't think that is justified. This is the story of how the international agencies have gradually caught up with a more realistic view of growth in China. We've indicated there successive forward projections of the growth expectations for China from or here from the International Energy Agency in particular, and what we see is a gradual catching up with reality, but one that has lagged well behind the reality, never properly caught up. And we still have a curious feature of the main international agency expectations of growth in China that has it coming right back down to a low level, in fact lower than it had been before, around 4% per annum from later in the current decade. If growth is a good thing, if you're optimistic to favour high growth, as I do, despite all of the challenges that high growth brings us, then one has to recognise the wisdom of Russia, the American expert on Japan, who at Harvard in the early post-war years used to come back every year to Harvard and revise his book called The United States and Japan Today. Every post-war year he'd come back and do a new edition of the book. And every year he would be thoroughly criticised for having been too optimistic about Japan. And after 4 or 5 years, when he'd come back, got that criticism, but the next year he had to upgrade his forecast even more, and again he'd be criticised for being too optimistic. And after this had happened through 5 revisions of the book, he says in his autobiography, the penny finally dropped. It's more scholarly to be pessimistic and wrong than optimistic and right. I feel a bit like that about China. I've always had but not always, since I started following China closely 30 years ago, always had what I thought of as realistic, but what others at the time always thought was an optimistic view of Chinese growth. Kim, fortunately, trusted my perspectives in a paper he wrote in 1988, so got a little bit more right than most of the perspectives at that time. But I've found that I've consistently underestimated growth, and that I've had to update, had to raise expectations of forward growth momentum progressively over a long period. It's just that I haven't been as badly wrong as anyone else. In these update projections, and Frank's work with me has been particularly important here, we've gone carefully through China's growth perspectives in an internally consistent growth accounting framework. There are some elements of the story that are pretty firmly in place. The underlying demographics aren't going to change very much between now and 2030. The main labour force demographics by 2030 have already been born, and quite a lot about investment in education, the upgrading of the labour force. We know that the total labour force in China is going to, because of that sharp demographic transition, going to be falling a couple of years from now. We know that the supply of relatively unskilled and relatively uneducated labour, the old cannon fodder of the labour-intensive industrial activities, is going to suffer a very sharp decline. And at the same time, you've got very strong growth momentum for demand for labour. There's going to be a smaller contribution from expansion of the labour force to Chinese growth from now on. That becomes quite a lot smaller through the 20s. So that's a source of long-term downward pressure. At the same time, the investment per young person in education is rising dramatically because total investment in education rising a lot, but the number of kids is falling, and so you've got rapid upgrading of the economic quality of the labour force. The quantity of labour is falling, but the economic quality of the labour force rising very rapidly. Second big component of growth, augmentation of the capital stock per person. Well, that's been a big source of growth in China. China's had higher savings rates for quite a long time than any other big country has ever had, and there's always been the view that that's a temporary thing and would fall away. Well, it hasn't fallen away much yet. Savings rates well over 50% of national income. That's been associated with investment rates that exceed those in any country ever, except very briefly Singapore, which was up around those levels for a while in the 1980s. Although you've had the highest investment rates we've ever had in a large economy, those rates have been well below the savings rates, and that of course generates the very large current account surplus of China. My expectation is that China's savings rates will fall, but when you have such a gap between savings and investment, such a surplus of savings, you can have savings fall without the investment rate coming down. The investment rate will be driven by opportunity for profitable investment. At the margin, investment rates, investment profitability is held up. Incentives for investment are very strong. I don't see the fall in the savings rate necessarily bringing back the investment rate. So there's going to be continued strong augmentation of the capital stock, probably no diminution of contributions from that area. Third area in the growth accounting framework where you get growth is growth in total factor productivity. China's productivity growth has been high. It's not like the Soviet Union, and it's not like some of the other Asian countries that were talked about in the end of the 80s. Now, what will happen to that through the demographic transition? Looking at the future in China, the big story is how the economy adjusts to the radical change in labour market conditions. Labour has become the Louisian surplus labour economy went out of existence a few years ago. You only get more labour into your factory now if you offer higher wages. Nominal wages have been rising about 20% per annum over the last few years, briefly interrupted by the Great Crash. That's going to continue. You're going to get very strong growth in real wages. That's likely to be actually an upward spur to increase in total factor productivity, and given the openness of the economy, the pervasive role of direct foreign investment inwards and increasingly outwards, there's no reason to expect that there will be an early diminution of total factor productivity growth. But as China gets closer to the global frontiers of productivity, there's less opportunity for easy gains in productivity through catching up, and that becomes, alongside the demographic factors, the reason we forecast a gradually easing back in Chinese growth through the 20s, still well above what the other agencies have. The end point of that is that China's average incomes in 2030 on these projections are about half of the United States in real terms, which means that the Chinese economy is about twice as big as the United States economy because it's 4 times as